Welcome to the Affirming Minds podcast, where we equip like-minded mental health professionals with a therapeutic toolkit that helps add to a more engaging, fulfilled, and effective mental health practice. Each empowering episode can stand alone as a continuing education pod course or a very valuable professional or personal resource with insightful expert interviews, practical resources, industry news, and lots of inspiration. We help the modern therapist thrive at work. Now let's welcome your host, a dedicated therapist and passionate educator, Shaina Siber, LCSW.
Welcome to the Affirming Minds podcast. I'm your host, Shaina Siber. I'm so happy that you tuned in today. This show is for educational purposes only and is not a substitute for professional treatment or clinical supervision. If you're in need of support, please reach out to a licensed mental health professional in your area. All clinical examples shared are fully de-identified composites or vignettes. No real client information is ever disclosed. If you're interested in earning continuing education credits for this episode, head to affirmmentalhealth.com. Our membership gives you access to CEs for live virtual workshops, self-study webinars, and eligible podcast episodes right here on the Affirming Minds podcast. A quick content warning for this episode. Today's episode includes discussions of intimate partner violence and domestic abuse. Please take care as you listen. Today's guest brings deep experience to this topic. Catrina Drinning-Davis is an LPC supervisor with over 13 years of experience in the mental health field. Based in Texas, she's also authorized to work with clients in Florida, Arizona, South Carolina, and Virginia. Catrina specializes in supporting survivors of domestic violence and relationship abuse, bringing her expertise as an EMDR-certified therapist to help guide her clients towards healing. With a deep passion for this work, Catrina's approach is all about empowerment and autonomy, helping survivors reconnect with their inner strength. She also offers free resources for survivors on her website, CatrinaLPC-S.com. We're excited to have her here today with us to share her insights and expertise. Before we get started, I wanted to offer a few clinical considerations to frame today's conversation. Intimate partner violence is common, complex, and often hidden in plain sight. In the U.S., about 1 in 4 women and 1 in 10 men experience violence by an intimate partner during their lifetime. Among teens, 1 in 10 high school students report physical harm by a dating partner. And rates for LGBTQ individuals are often similar or higher in certain subgroups like bisexual and transgender individuals, with some studies showing 61% of bisexual women and 54% of transgender individuals reporting IPV. We also know that it's not as simple as asking survivors to leave abusive situations. Women are 70 times more likely to be killed in the 2 weeks after leaving than at any other time during their relationship. We often think of safety planning as something that comes after abuse is named, but it's a critical harm reduction tool even when clients are staying uncertain or don't label what's happening as abuse. Trauma-informed safety planning includes digital safety, so things like turning off location sharing, using private browsing, and securing passwords, code words. These code words are for children or trusted friends to signal when to get help. Exit strategies, so identifying safe people, routes, or shelters, and environmental precautions, securing weapons, locking up sharp objects, avoiding high-risk areas during escalation like kitchens, bathrooms, garages, or stairwells. Clinicians must also assess lethality risk, which includes things like strangulation. Even one incident of strangulation makes someone 7.5 times more likely to be killed later by that partner. Firearm access. Firearm access increases the risk of homicide 5-fold. Problematic substance use in the abuser also elevates risk for intimate partner violence. The World Health Organization estimates that roughly 55% of domestic abuse perpetrators were drinking alcohol prior to the assault. Things like threats to kill, suicide threats, or threats towards pet or children, obsessive jealousy or stalking, reckless or threatening driving also signal elevated risk. This includes things like speeding while angry, swerving to intimidate, or refusing to stop the car. If your client describes any of these, even without calling it abuse, you can begin safety planning. Ask open-ended questions like, has your partner ever made you feel unsafe while driving? Or what does your worst argument look like with your partner? Do you ever feel afraid that things are going to escalate? Or do you ever worry for your safety when your partner is upset with you? It's also vital to understand how violence functions in the relationship. For some, it's a pattern of coercive control. For others, it may be situational violence, mutual violence, or chronic volatility or conflict. Not all IPV is the same, and neither are the clinical needs. Outside the therapy room, the most common intervention is a restraining order, but these are limited tools. Between 11 to 25% of women murdered by their partner had an active protection order at the time of their death. In fact, there's a 21% chance of increased violence shortly after one is issued, and less than 2% of perpetrators ever serve jail time. This is not to say that we shouldn't be encouraging survivors to utilize the court system to protect themselves and set boundaries. However, we need to recognize the limitations with carceral interventions alone. Violence is never just an individual problem, it's shaped by broader systemic forces like patriarchy, systemic racism, and poverty. Patriarchy teaches that dominance, control, and emotional suppression are masculine ideals. Patriarchal values also frame jealousy as love and punish women and historically marginalized genders for resisting and sometimes simply existing. It's embedded in social messaging and conditioning, courtrooms, law enforcement, and media. It tells us who to believe, who deserves protection, and who is to blame. Racism ensures that Black and Indigenous communities and other historically marginalized individuals are often over-policed and underprotected. It distorts credibility in court, limits help seeking, and leads to criminalization for survivors who fight back. Poverty is another huge systemic barrier. Poverty can make it nearly impossible to leave. Without access to safe housing, transportation, childcare, or legal resources, survivors face impossible choices. Disabled survivors often have significant limitations, including mobility issues and dependency on their abusers. Immigrant survivors often fear deportation or having their immigration status weaponized against them. LGBTQ survivors face additional barriers and oftentimes face erasure in conversations about intimate partner violence. Therapists should move beyond a carceral lens and support autonomy, dignity, and structural understanding. Without that, even well meaning interventions can re traumatize. With all that in mind, here's my conversation with Katrina. Katrina, thank you so much for being here today and joining me on the Affirming Minds podcast. It is just such a pleasure to have you on.
Thanks for having me.
Maybe can we start by just having you introduce yourself to our audience and share how you came to focus your work on intimate partner violence and domestic abuse?
Absolutely. So my name is Catrina. I'm an LPC supervisor in the state of Texas. And I started out with this population. I did my practicum at a domestic violence agency, fell in love with survivors. It's just so amazing to see their progress over time. And I don't know, just it just felt like I was led to be there.
That's amazing. Maybe can you start by walking us through what your sort of working definition of interpersonal violence I'm referring to as IPV. I think a lot of folks, when they think of intimate partner violence, their mind goes to the physicality, physical abuse, and I'm sure that is a component that you're seeing a lot in your work. But is there a way that you think would be helpful for us to just have an operational definition of IPV for the purposes of our conversation today?
Absolutely. With PV, DV, right? We think of violence, and it's more than that. It's patterns of abuse. It can be in various facets. So when I'm talking to my clients, I might say relationship abuse,
Mm.
and that is more approachable for them. Obviously, we want to stick with IPV, DV as clinicians. It's more than just physically being hit, it's the threat. It's hitting, pushing, threatening. It's financial abuse. It's controlling all of the money. It's sexual. It can be assault. It can be just pressure. It can be cheating, using the kids, right? It can be using them, undermining parenting, using the kids to abuse them. And it could be emotional, double standards, weaponizing information, feeding insecurities, can be digital. So it can be cyber stalking, cyber bullying. It can be monitoring. Can even be putting trackers on things. So that's both physical and digital, right, at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting you say that because I have found that more in clinical practice. A couple decades ago, you'd still have to go and present your identification in person to access your money. And you could still have this side bank account. And I think there'd be, not that it didn't happen. And I think in some ways that could isolate and silo someone more. But I think that I see a lot of people in situations where their partner has all of their account information. And if they're if they are thinking about leaving or setting boundaries, they're like, they'll wipe out my account. They'll take everything I have. I won't be able to live. I won't be able to pay my bills. And just that ability to just have access to one's own life, like on a device, is something that even we're thinking about, like prevention and safety planning of how do you protect your passwords? How do you create accounts that aren't clearly visible on your phone? Just having to understand how this might evolve as technology and life evolves in terms of these patterns of control and exploitation and all of those things. I'm glad you mentioned that. Are there any myths or misconceptions about IPV that you see among helping professionals?
Basically what you touched on, thinking it has to be violence, it has to be physical. I think sometimes even other clinicians get into that. They get into thinking that it has to be that. It has to escalate to that point to be IPV. Another myth that I've seen is men can't be abused.
Oh, yes.
And I actually had a supervisor say that to me.
Wow. The gender bias that can exist in that is really prevalent. And I think that is often a huge barrier for male survivors to come forward to get the resources they need, that they tend to not get the emotional support, even get mocked and made fun of or put down. So I think there is a long way to go on that, that it's not always the person who has the what we would consider the power position. I think really looking at the function of the relationship and relationship dynamics to say where are the power dynamics falling and why. And then, of course, when we're thinking about relationships that don't fall into these heteronormative frameworks or monogamous frameworks, that it can also lead to more complexity. Obviously, many people that are survivors of or in domestic violence relationships at this moment are cis women being abused by cis men, but we have to also say that's not the only relationship structure that is potentially at risk. So I think that's so key. And I would hope this isn't clinicians, but I think it's even just something like happening in the news right now, the Diddy trial, and seeing some of the reaction to Cassie's testimony. And you just see, like, even where I feel there in the last several decades, there's been more media representations of intimate partner violence. There's been more campaigns for psychoeducation about intimate partner violence. There is still so much misinformation about the risks for survivors leaving, the power dynamics that people trapped and entrenched in this relationship, that this idea that these relationships are devoid of any love, intimacy, moments of connection. It's all in that. So when someone has any ambivalence or expresses love towards their partner, then it's, oh, you decided to stay. And that's such as a victim blaming that can happen. I've seen so much, a lot of public support, obviously, for Cassie, but like also so much vitriol. And you really remember that the broader society is still lacks a complexity and depths of understanding trauma and how it impacts and shows up in relationships. What do you see as some of the early indicators or red flags that might show up in therapy that can signal someone has experienced IPV? Because I could imagine that there are people that are oftentimes like they're protective of their partners. Maybe they have shame about sharing it. Maybe they don't want to touch that with a 10-foot pole and almost want to work around it.
I think one of the major things that happens is they show up blaming themselves. They're trying to fix themselves because their partner's blaming them.
Yeah.
They may come in saying things like, "Oh, I just need to learn how to communicate better so I don't upset him," or "I'm just too sensitive and I need to deal with that." And those are the messages they're getting. They're blaming themselves. They don't see it as abuse. They see themselves as the problem.
So they're internalizing the messages where they wind up feeling responsible for regulating their partner, and instead of feeling like this is not acceptable, I'm in a dangerous situation, it's almost, what do I need to change about me that prevent triggering my partner, or prevent them acting out in a violent or aggressive way, or prevent them from controlling me, or feel like not trusting me enough, or feeling like I can't be trusted to go out with my friends, or whatever the case might be. Anything else that you see as potentially a red flag or something, like an indicator if someone isn't maybe disclosing or ready to disclose?
Or and it's not always about being ready to disclose. Sometimes it's about not seeing it. Conversations around the partner, you may notice them editing, you may notice them stopping themselves and shifting a bit. That may be something to kind of look at. What are you editing there? What were you going to say? Asking questions and trying to figure out what it was that they decided not to share because either it's embarrassing or something else.
So if you almost see they have to be super conscious of what they say, or if almost protecting their partner's image in that space, in that room.
Maybe, or you'll judge me if I tell you this.
Right. Yeah. How can therapists use a trauma-informed lens when working with clients who are in an abusive relationship?
Well, it's so important that we focus on autonomy, letting them set their own goals, not telling them what to do, not assuming they need to leave. That's not our place. And making sure that we give them permission all the way through, like permission to do whatever they want, to set whatever goal they want, to say no. And then we're asking for their buy-in throughout. Is it okay to go here? Is it okay to process this? I do a lot of EMDR. So is it okay to continue? Those sorts of things, to just check in with them, because in a lot of cases, they haven't been given any autonomy. They're told what to do. And so just doing that in therapy, just giving them permission to say no, permission to have control, it's a big deal.
Yeah, absolutely. So it sounds like a lot of invitational language. So inviting people
Mhm.
in, a lot of voice and choice, a lot of sure their values and preferences are honored. I think a lot of clinicians attach and care about their and protective of their clients, and understand the risk in intimate partner violent relationships, and that their desire for them to be out of it and be in safety and explore that you could have a better romantic relationship, better family structure, and maybe that imposing their wish and desire for their clients onto them, and not even maybe being aware of how that's showing up. And I do think inadvertently one that can be disempowering, but also we risk maybe alienating people, because if they're sensing that we're pushing where we should be making space, they might be getting, I'm not gonna bring this up again. I'm not gonna go there again. Or if they experience it as a judgment for staying, for being in the relationship. Yeah. I would think it would be great to talk a little bit about safety planning. Particularly, it sounds like for you, it's so important that we're honoring patients' preferences and their choice and their voice. So I imagine a lot of this means for many people staying in those relationship dynamics, cohabitating with abusive partners potentially. What for you what role does safety planning having this? What are the things you're thinking about?
Making sure that we understand the situation. Has there ever been any violence?
Mm.
What does that look like? Assessing that, doing some problem solving in terms of, if things escalate, what can you do? Where can you go? How can you make sure that you're not cornered? So do you have a place that you can exit? Or when things start to escalate, can you go outside? Or just looking for opportunities to be as safe as possible. And then also knowing what the resources are. So making sure they are aware, they can call the hotline, they can contact their support system, they can put the local domestic violence agency in their phone and hide that under a different person's name, like mom's work instead of TV agency or whatever. Making sure that we're helping them try to problem solve, even if they're not ready to go and we're not even ready to talk about that. It's good to start safety planning as soon as we recognize there's abuse.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's been really helpful for with some of my clients too, because they've been in situations where they're like, no, my phone is being monitored. Even their partners sometimes have a real issue with them coming to therapy because it's almost like a space, like oftentimes, like they can't, there's surveillance. And I think for some people that's threatening to the relationship. So I think what you were saying before, that they come in also blaming themselves. I've had clients say, this is the only way I was able to come here. I have to say, I'm working on my communication so I could be a better partner to you. That's my foray to even make this like a workable. But for some of my clients that like they're like, I can't look up anything on the phone because even if like if you signal certain words like in a Google search, domestic violence resources will come up. So I think a lot of my clients that start to have some insight something is wrong. I always talk about, if you have to Google, is this domestic violence? Is this abuse? You probably are finding yourself in that situation. A lot of folks are like, I can't let my partner see that is something that's coming up on my phone. So doing that work together and finding those numbers and finding those resources, because even like independently searching for them, they feel like they might not have the safety to do that, and thinking about saving it in their phone in a way that is more accessible, having a seasonal to go bag where they already have a copy of their keys in that bag and weather appropriate things, because when you're in the height of that conflict, not having to think and gather, like being able to get out as quickly as possible and save yourself some time until things de-escalate, even if you ultimately decide you're coming back into the home. And so it sounds like giving some pathways for harm reduction. And I think that piece is really important, of taking the responsibility of their partner's volatility or violence or control off of them. This is not about saying you need to be monitoring to make sure that he's not drinking, because that's not your responsibility. But yeah, maybe if you've noticed he's had a couple of drinks, tends to be a time where there's more risk, right? That if he starts raising his voice, maybe that's the time you grab the gym bag and you go. So many of the people, survivors I worked on, they take so much on, and then there's just so much emotional labor they're doing and monitoring they're doing, of always having to like walk on eggshells and take the temperature for safety reasons. So it's not necessarily a defense we're trying to turn off, but differentiating rather than internalizing it from a place of shame and responsibility, just like noticing the patterns and being able to externalize it a little bit more and think about what are your choices when you notice maybe these like warning signs that potentially you might be more at risk in the presence of your partner. I would love to get your thoughts, because I think there's a widely held belief for many people doing couples therapy that couples therapy is contraindicated when IPV is present. And I'm so curious, with your expertise, what are your thoughts on this? Do you think this is a stance that can create limitations in certain cases, perhaps when there's like mutual violence, or when someone is ambivalent or not ready to leave the relationship? What are your thoughts about like this being approached in through the lens of like more of a couples intervention?
I think it's normally not a good idea. Couples therapy should be a safe space. And if that information may be weaponized on the ride home or at a later date, that's scary. That's really scary. I think it's probably not a good idea. Even discernment counseling says to rule that out before moving forward.
Yeah. So when that is coming up and you recognize that if like you have someone you're working with through domestic violence and I want to try to make this work, and they are thinking about their options and saying, my partner's open to couples therapy, are you recommending a different pathway? I guess I'm just curious, like, how does the labor not wind up being solely on the square of the person who is experiencing the violence, particularly when we are mutually honoring the choice to stay when that is communicated by the survivor?
I would express my concerns and what I've seen in the past, how information has been weaponized, how it can be very volatile. I would give some examples of that to my clients. They can make a decision to either move forward with it or wait and see.
Is there then a communication about the alternative path of their partner getting their individual treatment and having some sort of collateral communication? Because I think the other piece is I've worked with people on both sides of this dynamic. I'm not even going to assume to start to generalize why someone engages in violent and controlling behaviors. I've seen it triggered by anything from a substance use disorder to a narcissistic personality disorder presentation to someone with PTSD who has a lot of anger and volatility. It can be a wide variety of ultimately that person is accountable for their behaviors. And there's all different sort of contexts where someone might be at risk for developing violent and controlling behavioral patterns within the context of an intimate partner relationship. But sometimes I see that insight is wavering for that person. And them going to therapy. I've had a lot of experiences where someone's abusive partner went to therapy and they're like, they told me they went to therapy one time and the therapist told them they didn't have any issues and they don't need therapy. So I definitely understand that perhaps that that couples therapy is contraindicated for all sorts of reasons of preserving the safety of both parties. And is there any sort of is a willingness of the other person to start to get therapy that there can be an entryway to provide some collateral or participate in a way where we can at least give some signal of like maybe a more clear representation of what's going on if perhaps the person doesn't have the insight, has their own protective parts that are preventing them from disclosing that they've engaged in abusive behaviors. Because again, this could look so different on so many different dynamics. I think there's people that they're doing this repeatedly, they have no remorse, they're blaming the other person. Then there's other people that have impulse control issues and they have a lot of shame about the behaviors they're engaging in. So this is, I think, on there's it's not a monolith. There's a lot of different ways this can manifest behaviorally. Violence is so pervasive in our culture at large, and intimate partner violence is so unfortunately so common. So I'm curious, like your thoughts on that.
Well, in terms of collaboration between the different therapists, absolutely, that would be something I would be willing to do. However, I've not seen that play out. And normally, if the abusive partner does go to therapy, it's like you said, they go once and suddenly they don't need therapy, or they're going to get around to it, or they don't want any collaboration. So I've really not had that experience where there actually was collaboration, which is
Interesting.
interesting.
Yeah, it is one of those new things I'm always curious about because obviously there's so many people that are survivors of abuse and violence of variations. And I think we need better resources. I appreciate your expertise because I think there needs to be real healing because this can be such a painful experience that affects someone's life, no matter the brevity or pervasiveness of a relationship. I do a lot of work with people who are survivors of sexual abuse and childhood sexual abuse. We don't have great resources for the people who are doing the abusing. And like, if we never get to the point of healing the people who are perpetuating the harm, we are always in this reactionary stance as a field. And so I'm always thinking about prevention. How do we reach the people that are in these cycles of abuse that oftentimes have multiple victims over the course of their life and get them the resourcing and healing they need to stop perpetuating these cycles. And again, I think oftentimes, not always, but frequently are also stuck in cycles of generational trauma themselves. So it is such a complex space. So, how do intersecting identities like race, gender identity, immigration status, socioeconomic background impact how survivors experience IPV and access support?
So anything can be weaponized, right? Especially in a relationship. And so immigration status is a big one, holding back any help for visas or citizenship and holding it over their head. If you just do X, Y, and Z, then I will do that. And years go by, decades go by, and it continues to be something to manipulate and control. Pretty much anything can be used against someone, their gender, whether male, female, trans, other gendered, it can be used against them for sure. And really, no one's immune because every socioeconomic level can be impacted. They're very affluent people can be stuck in those relationships.
Yeah. Yeah. And I do think, of course, the amplification of that stuckness, like you said, if someone is holding your documentation or someone is like, you don't have somewhere to live, you don't have money in the bank, you don't have food to feed your children, you don't have a safe place to go. So I think when you don't have the social and financial resources, again, it's just, again, like closing the window for those potential options. And that can be really difficult in just some of those like logistical factors. And we do know how much that risk can elevate when someone is initially leaving the relationship. That risk for violence goes way, way up. And so if there isn't like a safe landing pad, then that could be really difficult. Do you think that's also maybe one of the areas that either within the field or in the broader community, people don't seem to really grasp that it's not, oh, leaving equals safety. That like that maybe some people have carry around that myth. I don't know if you could speak to a little bit about like the risk that sometimes happens about people actually trying to exit these relationships.
Yeah, absolutely. Leaving can mean being murdered. It can mean being stalked. It can mean just living in fear, being kidnapped, put in a cage. It can be a lot of different things. It can be really scary. And that's the scariest time for someone is when they're leaving. And so making sure that they have a good safety plan, making sure that they have a solid plan in place to be safe is so important. It really
Yeah,
is.
yeah, absolutely. And as you were talking about the withholding of paperwork and things like that, something else that I was thinking about this more public celebrity showcasing of intimate partner violence with Diddy and Cassie was that one of those things emerging is that being in this intimate partner violence and like that route to like sex trafficking, and that so many people that are victims of sex trafficking are actually like their foray into being trafficked is actually through a partner, which I think I was new information to me, but it just goes to show like a lot of the myths we have about abuse in general, whether that be sexual abuse or physical assault, is like we're thinking it's like the stranger in the night, like the kidnapper, the person, not someone where there's embedded trust and intimacy and connection. But this is just like another one of these societal horrific experiences like trafficking, and that actually domestic violence being like a direct route to that sort of partner exploitation. What are some of the systemic barriers that survivors face when they try to seek help? And how can we as clinicians avoid reinforcing them?
Don't blame the survivor.
Yeah.
I hear that a lot, that it's your fault. You're choosing to stay. You're choosing to be there. No one chooses abuse. No one chooses it.
Yeah.
And it doesn't happen instantly, right? It's slow.
Yeah.
It's very slow. Don't blame them. Be curious. Figure out, walk with them, but don't blame them.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of barriers there. So difficulty getting help because of the track, like you said, being tracked and monitored, and they can feel really paranoid, which is valid. They have every reason to be paranoid. Stuff is going on. People are being monitored. I had a client recently, the ex put a tracker on her vehicle to keep her safe, keep her safe. So in case something happened, he would know where she was. No, that's control, right? Don't assume their goal is to leave. I think we automatically go there. And I think it's important that we find out what their goals are.
Yeah. Absolutely. And we had a phenomenal speaker on the podcast, Sarah Wolfer. They really were speaking to non-monogamous relationships and really understanding that more broadly in clinical spaces. And something that they brought up that I thought has been really important to think about in the context of the conversation we're having today is thinking about relationship agreements versus what can be very toxic, even culturally affirmed or reinforced things of like controlling relationship dynamics that can happen in monogamous cis heteronormative relationships. I even hear sometimes like women like joke about putting air tags on their partners and like watching them wherever they go. And I think because the power dynamic, again, we're thinking of men, cis men not traditionally being the person at risk in those relationships. We laugh those things off, but I think there's a lot of toxic messages we get about control in relationships and having to be everything to the other person. And I think that taking a step back and really thinking about having agreements with your partner that are based on mutual respect and values, and even if it doesn't reach the level of intimate partner violence, there's a lot of unhealthy dynamics that can be rooted in control and being controlling in both directions that are something to really look at and understand. It's something that I see come up is more on we're both located in the US, and state to state, there are also different systemic policies of how domestic violence is interfaced with at the police level. There are some states, if the police are called to your home for domestic disturbance, they essentially try to assess what's going on. If there's a suspicion that there is a perpetrator of said domestic disturbance, that person will be arrested, whether that other partner is communicating they want that person arrested or not. There are other states where the victim has to file charges and make a statement. I'm curious for you, we're talking about autonomy and preferences and choices. I think that those systemic solutions have been put in place, I think oftentimes with the right motivation to try to take some of that pressure off the victim from being held responsible for their partner's arrest and potentially making that person more at risk. Also, given the nature of how many people are murdered by their spouse, wanting to take it seriously and from a state of prevention, like start this process of having a criminal record before someone, God forbid, is murdered by their partner. But I'm curious from you on that systemic level, when you're thinking about interface with the legal system in terms of arrest, prosecution, sentencing, are there thoughts that you have about what the criminal justice system is getting wrong in terms of its interface with intimate partner violence survivors?
I think there's no perfect answer. I
Mhm.
mean, if the legal system decides to pursue it, the survivor doesn't have a choice. Also, they may pay the price for it. They may still be punished for it. However, maybe that becomes an opportunity for the survivor to get away. They use that weekend in jail to go ahead and move states or do something else that gives them opportunity.
So it sounds like from a policy standpoint, you don't necessarily endorse any one strategy. There's like risks and benefits across the board.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of nuanced parts to it. I think there is no perfect answer. I think the survivor should be empowered to either get involved and file charges or not based on what they want.
Yeah, absolutely. How do you guide therapists in managing their own internal reactions, especially around feelings of urgency or maybe again wanting to exercise some feeling of effectiveness when a client is in an unsafe relationship? Is there something guidance you're giving to therapists and how to manage their own reactions?
And that's really hard. I hear all the time from therapists, I'm not doing enough. I'm letting my client down.
Yeah.
And the reality is, they're still trying to figure out, is this abuse? Is what I'm dealing with, is this abuse? Do I see another step forward? We have to really slow down and meet them where they are and walk with them where they are. We're like ready to help them pack their bags and they're not there.
Yeah. So just like they're like slowing it down and slowing down that reaction.
And reminding them that walking with them isn't being that weekly reality test, that this is abusive. This isn't okay.
One of the other challenges I think that can be really difficult depending on your state is there is many states where in terms of child protective service calls, we talk about like blaming the survivor, that when there is domestic violence, that it can initiate a mandated report call from a clinician. And oftentimes it is quite punitive to the survivor in terms of their parental rights, removal of children, the way that the whole thing is conceptualized. And it's one of those other like imperfect things where, of course, we would be in denial if we didn't pretend violence in a home doesn't put everybody in the home at risk, including the children and very young children, of course, not just psychologically, but on just a bodily safety level. And to me, that's been one of the most heartbreaking systemic issues and one of the most complex ethical issues I see clinicians dealing with who both have mandated reporting requirements to maintain their license, but I think to a greater extent to protect the client and their family more broadly. What are your thoughts around that? How do you guide people through some of those ethical challenges that come up with this patient population?
It's our job to report. We have to report if there's a child or elderly or disabled person involved. We have to report. We have to protect those that need to be protected. It does make things complicated for the survivor. It makes things really complicated for them. And also, sometimes opportunity comes out of it, resources come out of it, motivation for something different does come out of it. I know it's far more complicated than that, but maybe it saves their life.
Yeah. Yeah. And it sounds like some of that is also just in supporting their decision making and supporting their autonomy, but also being able to be the mirror of the consequences in a non shaming way. But some of the consequences of continuing to be in the relationship are you being killed, you being seriously injured, you losing your employment, you losing your relationships, but also like potentially your children being hurt or your children being removed from your care. I think one piece of this is like they're surviving the day, they're surviving the moment because they are in imminent danger. So their repertoire of choices, a lot of it is just based around survival, and maybe some of that clinical work is creating some space to say, okay, let's think forward a month, 6 months, a year. If nothing changes, what are some of the risks and the consequences that may happen? So I think, yeah, it can be
Right.
so much into just surviving the day, getting through the next conflict, surviving like the next blow up versus having a little bit more of that bird's eye view.
It's not just that. You make great points about the child being in danger and all of these consequences. But I've met many children who their parent was murdered in front of them and they have to live with that. And so we don't know what we could be preventing by making that call, but we could be helping to prevent some of those things.
Are there times when well intentioned therapeutic approaches might actually replicate control dynamics or be disempowering to the survivor?
I think sometimes we can be very harsh when we're really direct. So I think there are some therapeutic approaches that might do that. I had someone tell me my last therapist was disappointed in me that I wouldn't leave, and I felt like a failure. So maybe too direct is sometimes harsh. Other factors, if we ask our clients to do CBT, let's say, now we're asking them to write down their thoughts. And now that can be weaponized against them
Yeah.
because that could be picked up or used later. I think we just have to be really mindful of what we're doing and how it can be used, which is difficult, right? Like we're not manipulative people typically. So we're not thinking about like, how can this be used against our client, but it can. So being mindful of what's being written down, what's being said, how it's being addressed, and just really slowing down and making sure that our clients are prepared. So like I said, I do a lot of EMDR, so I spend a lot of time in phases 1 and 2. So the history taking, preparation, they have to be ready. They have to be ready and able to tolerate the work. We can't just dive forward because we're ready for them to leave, which is what I think we all feel because we want them to be in a better place. We see this great, wonderful potential. I want to help them hurry up and get there.
Yeah. So you mentioned EMDR. Are there specific tools, frameworks, resources, and feel free to speak more on EMDR or anything else that you're using regularly or recommending regularly that you recommend for therapists who want to feel more comfortable working with IPV?
I think EMDR can be very helpful because there is a lot of opportunities for targets. There's a lot of physical violence, negative messaging, and opportunity for us to work through that. I think there's a lot of resourcing that goes on with EMDR that our clients can benefit from. In situations where they don't want to leave, we can help them change that internal messaging. So even if culturally, even if in their own choices, they don't want to leave, they can still change that internal piece through EMDR or some other trauma-informed approaches.
What is your take on how and when to use psychoeducation about trauma bonding or attachment within abusive relationships?
We have to be gentle with that. We don't want to give the message that, oh, this is a trauma bond. We're stuck. We're bonded. We're stuck. I think we have to be more gentle and start to identify abuse, identify patterns, and then slowly move towards the next steps. Once a person is out of the relationship and they're missing the abusive ex, like I hear it all the time. Why do I miss them? What is that about? Then I think once they're out of the relationship, they can start to understand those things better, that there is that bond. It was reinforced through this trauma cycle, through this abuse cycle, and it takes time to disconnect that.
Yeah. 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 When you mentioned that there is many folks that a lot of the work is just getting them to come to their own conclusion that the relationship dynamics are abusive. Mm. I imagine some of that in my clinical experience, some of that is because the template of their relationships, their family of origin, there was a lot of volatility, there was a lot of control dynamics, there was a lot of violence. I guess my curiosity would be about like when it may be, again, this is not about holding people responsible for other people's abusive behavior, but perhaps understanding why it can be difficult to spot it and name it. Do you feel like there's any psychoeducation piece that goes into that's been important in your work?
Absolutely. So the hotline has a power and control wheel. I feel like it was missing a lot. So I went ahead and created the types of abuse. So it's a worksheet that I offer for free, and it really breaks down the different types of abuse. And when I give that to clients, it can be very powerful. So I find that if a client will ask me, hey, is this abuse? And I say yes, they're like, yeah, okay. But if you hand them a piece of paper where it's written down, that's more validating for them. Being able to see it in black and white is more validating for them.
Yeah. Almost
So
like there's these different domains, and then like you could see a behavior and be like, oh, like they've done that to me.
exactly.
Right.
Yeah, feeding insecurities, weaponizing the parenting, weaponizing information. There are a lot of different things that we don't necessarily think of as abuse. And until you look at it, you might not have even had a word for it.
What is one thing you would want every therapist listening to take away from this conversation, especially those who feel unsure or unprepared to address IPV in their practice? Because obviously have been working and specializing in this space, but I think every clinician in community mental health, whether you're working with families, whether you're working with adults, you're working with older adults, that domestic violence, intimate partner violence can show up in any clinical context, acute settings, outpatient settings. So I think we all have to be prepared, whether this is our life mission to specialize in this work So I'm curious for you, like what's like the takeaway you really want to for people to land with clinicians after this conversation we're having today?
I really just want to drive home the point that this is a generalist issue. 1 in 3 women will experience it in their lifetime per reports, 1 in 7 men. And there was a study that 1 in 2 transgender people will. So they're showing up in your therapy room,
Yeah.
whether we're identifying them or not. I would say be curious, be empathetic, empower them, focus on autonomy, and just ask permission along the way. I think those are the big things. I know there's a lot of things, but we're already doing that with a lot of clients. So just being really careful and not jumping ahead of them.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for your time today. Would you be able to share with our audience more about where to find you, find out more about the amazing work you're doing, some of these great resources that you've created, where folks can find them and add those to their therapeutic toolkit?
Absolutely. So my website is Catrina LPC-S. So that's CATRINA LPC-S.com. And I have worksheets that are free. I have a continuing education. And also I offer a free peer support group. So anyone can join that who is a clinician. All of that is available on my website to sign up for.
Thank you so much, Katrina, for being here today. I really appreciate our conversation.
Thank you for joining our community on the Affirming Minds podcast. If you loved this episode as much as we did, please follow us wherever you listen to your podcasts and share it on your socials. If you want more information about how this podcast can add to your continuing education credits, visit affirmmentalhealth.com. And remember, let's affirm, heal, and grow together.